This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chancellor Sam Hoggett, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here. And today we have really an extraordinary honour in welcoming the Honourable Diana DeGette as our Chancellor's Health Policy Lecturer this year. Representative DeGette is serving her 9th term in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the 1st District of Colorado, which encompasses the majority of the Denver metropolitan area. As a member of the powerful Committee on Energy and Commerce, a committee that has vast jurisdiction over many areas that are of great interest to UCSF, including healthcare, trade, business, and technology. She's one of the leading voices in the current healthcare debate in this country, and very importantly to us, she's become one of the Congress's leading experts in scientific research and pushing an agenda that we are very grateful for. Among her many accomplishments, she was the chief architect of legislation to expand stem cell research, and I don't know whether you've seen our wonderful stem cell research building out the back, but we'd be happy to show that to you. Really, I'm told, actually wrote the legislation that President Obama used to overturn the restriction on federal support for embryonic stem cell research. She's also the co-chair of the Bipartisan Congressional Diabetes Caucus, and in that role has been a long-term advocate for the expansion of diabetes care and research, particularly for lower income and minority communities. And then earlier this year, along with Representative Fred Upton, the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, they are working on a very important initiative, the 20th Century Cures, which will, I think, based on what we heard in a meeting just before this, fundamentally help push our country into a new era of scientific discovery by looking at organization of federal agencies and organizing the country to push the agenda better. They've had a series of hearings and roundtables across the country, and I think are now beginning to actually pen the legislation, which hopefully will pass through the Congress and then the Senate in the spring. So today, Representative DeGette will, in fact, be discussing the goals of the 21st Century Cures and share what she and the committee have heard from around the country. So please join me in welcoming the Honourable Diana DeGette.
Thanks so much, Chancellor Hoggett. I'm so honored to be here with you here today to talk to you about an exciting time in medical research and health policy. It's not often that somebody can come from Washington and give you good news about some bipartisan collaboration, but that's exactly what I want to do with you here today. For the past century, new discoveries have delivered groundbreaking treatments that have completely changed human health in this country and around the world. We've developed antibiotics, we've introduced vaccines, and we've pioneered medical treatments that were unimaginable only a generation or two ago. So our challenge today, as I see it, is to sustain this pace of innovation as we move through the 21st century and push human health to a place that we can't even imagine today. But for several years, it's become increasingly apparent to a number of us that our medical research system has been unable to keep pace with changes throughout our healthcare system, even after we doubled the NIH budget in 2001. In large part, that's because after we doubled that budget in what we thought was a visionary, groundbreaking effort, we then just reversed those budget decisions a few years later. The 2011 budget sequestration that congressional Republicans negotiated with President Obama hit biomedical research especially hard, and that has in turn hampered efforts at labs and universities around the country. Not only were ongoing projects slowed, but new work was almost stopped completely at one point. And we consistently hear stories about how young researchers, some who we might have in this room right now, will not be able to begin their careers and start down the path to the groundbreaking discoveries that our healthcare system needs. The NIH director, Francis Collins, has been outspoken about this problem, and with the recent challenges that we're facing with the Ebola outbreak, we see a grim example of the consequences of our medical research slowdown. In recent weeks, I've been speaking with Dr. Collins about this issue, and at a roundtable that we had just a few weeks ago, Dr. Collins pointedly said that because of the budget cuts of the last few years, we're about 5 years behind where we would have been on Ebola research had we not had the budget cuts. And Dr. Collins opined that if we had been able to have adequate funding for this research, we may have had a vaccine, or certainly been well on the way to a vaccine by this time. And beyond the status of a single disease, we know and we see the need to improve our medical research infrastructure and deliver cures more quickly. For example, it takes about 10 years and $1 billion for a new drug to make it through the approval process. Rules and procedures for clinical trials that were once best practices can now hamper new advances and keep treatments from reaching patients. In fact, after Congress helped deliver some alternative approval pathways that dealt with treatments for urgent, emerging, or unmet needs, as many as half of the new drug approvals have relied on those workarounds. So these protocols were developed for just a few diseases, but now everybody's using them because they work so well. So clearly, workarounds are not the way to solve this problem. Clearly, we need a better framework. In the meantime, countries like India, Singapore, and Brazil are aggressively raising their investments in research. And within the next 5 years, China may actually invest more than we do right here in the U.S. So bringing new partners into the research and medical cures community is a great thing, but not as at the expense of the well-established community and protocols that we have right here in the United States. So how do we go about doing all of that? Together with Congressman Fred Upton, who's a Republican from Michigan and is the chair of the powerful House Energy and Commerce Committee, I'm working to completely update our medical research system to get treatments and cures much more quickly from the research lab to patients in the clinic. We're calling our effort 21st Century Cures, and we spent this past spring and summer taking a broad view of what our system looks like today and what we can do to realistically improve it. Let me give you a couple of examples of just some of the types of issues that we're talking about and success stories that we hope we can replicate. First of all, institutional review board reform. Institutional review boards are the perfect example of an important safety process that can sometimes get in its own way. Protecting patients, especially those who participate in research, is a fundamental obligation rooted in the Hippocratic Oath. But we can be much smarter about how we ensure that protection. A few weeks ago in Denver, my congressional district, district, the director of the University of Colorado's Cancer Center was sharing his frustrations with the IRB process and having spent years trying to reform the current system. I was encouraged to look around the round table we were having, and I saw heads nodding all around the room when he talked about the problems with the IRB process. The current program frustrates researchers with duplicative boards, multiple definitions, and layers of approval that don't serve well, especially in national studies where several institutions are participating. For example, if the University of Colorado wants to do a collaboration with the UCSF, what would happen would be people would have to go through a bifurcated IRB process, oftentimes wasting time and incredible resources trying to get 2 IRB approvals. That's saying nothing about an IRB approval involving a partnership between a public and a private entity who are trying to do a research study. Past attempts at specific IRB reforms, including several bills that I have introduced over the years, have fallen short when one stakeholder finds a problem with proposed changes. But in the context of a broader effort to improve research and cures, I'm optimistic that we've now flipped the script. Instead of trying to block specific changes, we see people finally understanding that we need a systemic improvement of the IRB process in this country. Another area that we can improve our biomedical research system is to foster collaboration with disease advocacy communities to gain access to critical patient information in developing clinical trials and moving towards treatments. For example, in early 2012, the Food and Drug Administration approved Kalydeco to treat a rare form of cystic fibrosis. What made this particular drug approval remarkable was the collaboration between the cystic fibrosis community and the FDA to improve testing and make approval possible among a small group of patients. The disease community's role cannot be understated here. They could not only identify almost everyone across the country battling cystic fibrosis, but they also knew what genetic variants affected specific patients. This knowledge and a willingness by the patients to share their genetic information safely helped design a better clinical trial that accurately assessed the drug's potential. Without this collaboration, regulators probably would not have been able to agree to a tailored approval. Now, while not every disease advocacy community is as tightly knit and well organized as cystic fibrosis, we do have a model for working with the public so that we can share data safely that can contribute to finding cures. People want to help in these efforts, and by definition, the causes are deeply personal to patients and their patients. The more we can do to engage the general public and to help them to organize and share data with researchers, the sooner that we can deliver cures that can save lives and dramatically improve efforts. And of course, all of these efforts are improved by electronic medical records and by the mapping of the human genome, because now we have ways to collect data, to safely and securely store the data, and allow it to be shared among researchers. So I want to talk for a minute, though, about the bigger issue that Fred and I are working on. This IRB issue that I talked about and the community role in harnessing genetic information to expedite biomedical research are two very different cases that I think show why we can make meaningful change to our research system in this country. While both of the stories are well known to the experts that follow those issues closely, we haven't been able to harness the political energy in Congress to make changes until now. Now, Now, as Fred Upton and I have talked to people in the research community, including prominent researchers right here from UCSF, we have seen a surprising level of consensus about what we need to do to improve the system, be they senior government officials, lab directors, drug and medical device companies, patient advocacy groups, or anyone else who cares. We see some clear areas where legislation can make a difference. We know what rules frustrate researchers and why, so we can modernize clinical trials and keep our efforts focused on the science. We have a better sense of what reforms in the past, like electronic health records, need further development so that our information boom can be harnessed. We have models for developing drugs and devices to address unmet needs and reach small groups of patients. We know how public involvement and cooperation can help focus research projects and speed the cure process. Now, these ideas are not completely new, but when we add them all together and we bring them into one place, we have the makings of a cures transportation. We've had now, I think, 4 or 5 hearings in the Energy and Commerce Committee. We've had 6 or 7 roundtables, including a roundtable in Denver, Colorado, and just last week one in Kalamazoo, Michigan. We've been taking evidence on the web and on the internet. We've been taking all kinds of evidence every place we can, and now Chairman Upton and I have decided to undertake the hard job. We're in the early stages of writing legislation, and Fred and I have said we want to think big. We want to think about the structure of our research institutions in this country, and we want to think about how to make it work for the cures that we need in the 21st century. We plan to have a draft ready later this year or early in the new year, and in the meantime, we plan to continue to work and listen to what we need for a world-class medical research system for the next century. So that's sort of the framework of what we're working on, and what I'd like to do now, we've got some time, I'd like to spend some time answering your questions about what we're up to, the concerns you have, whatever we can do. So thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm very eager to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate everything you're doing to help promote research and breakthroughs. I chair the Medicare Evidence Development and Coverage Advisory Committee, and through that work and some others, I also have a concern that sometimes we have things that come on the market, particularly medical devices and some drugs, because they're getting approved on accelerated pathways and surrogate markers, they don't actually have proof of clinical benefit. You know, we've approved them with the promise of a benefit, but then they turn out not to have a benefit or even to be dangerous. And then they're very hard to get off the market. And in fact, they're almost never off the market. And we end up spending hundreds of billions of dollars on some things that don't have evidence. And I'm just wondering, and often at CMS we hear, well, FDA approved it and CMS should cover it. And unfortunately, because the criteria for FDA are different and don't include reasonable and necessary, which is the criteria for Medicare coverage, my concern is that we're, while trying to get new breakthroughs on the market, also letting dangerous drugs and devices on the market that are very hard to get off and costing a lot of money.
Well, the issue that you raise is an important issue, but it's interesting because the issue I hear much more often is that people have a difficult time getting CMS to approve Medicare coverage for drugs or devices that have been approved by the FDA. So I often hear the reverse. But the reason why some of these processes were put into place for expedited approval for some of these devices and also, of course, our new Breakthrough Therapies law for drugs is because we have some areas where we haven't had treatments where we need to have those treatments. The solution, and actually, again, there's a growing consensus in Washington. It's always a balance, right? You don't want useful treatments treatments to be held up in the bureaucracy. Right now, I think it takes over 10 years, and I just said it in my last speech, 10 years and what is it? What is the old adage about Washington? $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon it adds up to real money. But so on the one hand, you have the terrible cost and time that it takes to get genuine treatments. But then on the other hand, you have the safety and efficacy issues with some of these drugs and devices that have gone through the expedited approval process. The answer to that, which we have not had sufficiently in the U.S., is robust post-market review. And I have heard this time and time again from the reviewers over at the Food and Drug Administration and others. If you are going to have an expedited process, then you have to beef up your post-market review, both for safety and efficacy, and also, of course, for costliness. So I agree with you, that's part of what we need to do. And one of the first things that got cut when they cut the budget was some of these programs for post-market review.
Right, I agree with you. I think post-market review is important, and especially using the data, making it publicly available, which
Right.
generally is not. Actually, a lot of post-market review studies never actually get done, and
Right.
then feeding it back in. And I agree, it's a very complicated issue. I was just going to give one example. When people say that it's proton beam therapy, which Medicare not only pays for, but pays for extremely generously, a lot of private insurers don't pay for it because there is no evidence that it's any better than a lot of more conservative and much cheaper therapies on the market. Yet as proton beam centers are being built across the country, you can be sure that Medicare will be paying for more and more costly and unnecessary proton beam therapy.
You know, I recently had a gentleman come into my office in Denver and meet with me, and he was very upset because he couldn't get a therapy that he had that was actually an individualized therapy and expensive for people approved. And he said, I've been trying to get it approved, and we've done all of the studies to show that it's safe. And I said, well, that's wonderful. Does it work? And he said, who cares? It might. And I said, well, I think it's going to be difficult for the FDA to approve a treatment that you have no evidence that it works. And what's more, you're never going to have CMS approve a treatment that costs $5,000 per treatment unless you can show that it works. But I think that's some of the misinformation people have. I said, look, you know, if your treatment doesn't work, even though it's safe, you might as well dangle crystals over people, right? You have to have both. So I agree.
So I'm Laura Ventvier. I'm part of the faculty at UCSF, and my background is in molecular diagnostics and molecular biology, and I'm particularly interested in the work you're doing, and I applaud you for all the work you're doing, making this a bipartisan effort, because I think that's really very efficient. Efficiency is also a topic for your healthcare improvements, and as you just exemplified in your breakthrough cures. My question is about what do you think about new ways to evaluate and validate drugs. And so there's this whole system of phase 1 to phase 4 trials, which can take like thousands of patients, and based on identified endpoints, for which sometimes you do need trials with thousands of patients. There's some efforts put forward by the FDA for accelerated approval. There might be mechanisms that would include coverage with evidence development. And so will your legislation that you're working on include statements on, for instance, coverage with evidence development, which maybe the CMS might not be so much in favor of, but will you work on that part, and also in how to accelerate drugs that get into, can be used into market?
These are exactly the issues that we're tackling in our legislation. And we've had comments, as I said, from across the community, from researchers, from pharmaceutical companies and device companies, and many others. And And of course, the balance is what we were just talking about, making sure that really looking at the way we do the human subject research in this country to see if there's ways that we can streamline it, that we can get whatever the study size that we need to do the research, and then to see if we can expedite approval where appropriate. But that is always the balance, of course, of making sure that you're not cutting corners to do that. And so we're working on language right now with Dr. Collins at the NIH and with all of his experts to make sure that as we do that, we can move it forward. You know, it was interesting. A couple of years ago, we passed the Breakthrough Therapies legislation where people can actually get expedited review through the FDA, and that's what I was referring to in my remarks, where now people who, maybe it's not a breakthrough therapy, but people who have a new drug that could be really exciting are going through that process simply because it's so much more efficient and cuts red tape. So I think that if we can get this right, what we can do is we can expedite research and get these approvals through the FDA much more quickly and get these drugs and devices on the market. One thing I didn't mention in my prepared remarks, but has been a problem, well, I mentioned it at the beginning, is really the need for, number one, adequate funding for these agencies so that they can hire reviewers who have the technical training to know what they're seeing and to be able to do it. On some of the complex biologics, it's been very hard for people to find reviewers at the FDA who could actually do a robust review, and you need to be able to hire those folks. And then the second thing is to have a sustained level of funding, both at the FDA and at the NIH, so that you can support that research and then the review process. If you are continually losing those folks to private industry, then you lose that base of knowledge.
Maybe a follow-up question is, and to push it a little bit further. So my background is in genomics, and what we see in patients with late-stage disease, that there might be there's a need actually to come to a system where sort of genomics research for cancer patients, for instance, can identify altered genes, mutations in genes that may pop up that would indicate drug use that is not approved for that particular cancer type but in another one. And so it's really hard to come up with a system where you can get that towards an approval. However, I think partly based on financing through NIH and NCI through their big data to knowledge centers, there is a global activity of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, and we are partnering in that alliance, where it's really pushed for all of these exceptional results and unique patients to come to a global registry. And so I think that might be something that's really important to advocate for, because to really come to these unique patients and exceptional results registrations is the only way we can identify what might work and what might not work. So is that a part of your...
And that's, you're exactly right. And that's not just true for diseases like cancer, where you might have some genetic specificity. It's for some of the rare diseases, and that's why I mentioned the cystic fibrosis issue, is because when you have diseases where you might have very few patients, there was recently an article in the New Yorker, I don't know if any of you saw it, about some patients who had a very rare, their children had a very rare disease. They were able to come together over the internet, and they actually hired researchers who were able to connect them. But before technology, those families would have never found each other. So it works in both directions.
There's another famous story which was highlighted by the AACR at the beginning of this year about a girl, a 14-year-old girl, who did that for her own disease.
Right.
And in that way she found the cure.
Right, and so the potential is enormous, and we want to make sure that our governmental institutions are building that, not resisting that.
So I also think it's really important to come to these global registries.
Yes, I agree.
Hi, Diana. Thanks for coming and speaking to us tonight. My name's Steve Falbo. I'm a researcher up in the hepatology department here, and also was lucky enough to grow up in the 1st District in Colorado. But I wanted to ask
Do you still have relatives there?
Yeah.
I think I know some of your relatives.
Yes, you do. I wanted to ask
So
you
do
a
you.
question about the IRB issue that you were talking about, because having been a researcher here, I've run into a lot of the difficulties you were talking about with multiple different types of IRB, and I know in the last few years there's been a bit of a push to use centralized IRB to coordinate between private institutions and public institutions, and yet UCSF, understandably in my opinion, is kind of dubious about using some of these for-profit IRBs, centralized IRBs. So when you talk about having more standardization, are you talking about like more standardized definitions and rules throughout all IRBs, or are you talking about trying to get more centralized IRBs to make the process easier?
No, what I've been talking about for all these years is, for example, standardizing this seems simple to me, but obviously nothing's simple when you're talking about these things, to get a standardized definition of the common rule between, and this is not so much of an issue with research institutions like UCSF, but what we were finding with IRB, well, let me back up for a minute, because what happened was traditionally most biomedical research was done in institutions like UCSF or University of Colorado, academic research institutions. But then what we started to see about 20 years ago, we started seeing more and more people doing human subject research. And so there were wide definitions of what the common rule was between private research and publicly financed research. Most of the research institutions developed a standardized protocol, but the protocol varies very widely, even to this day, among different groups that are doing it. And I think it's important to have a standard definition and to know what you're doing when you do human subject research. An apocryphal example that I give all the time is one where there was a plastic surgeon, and I think it was a plastic surgeon, and in private practice, and this person decided to do human subject research to see which of his facelift different procedures worked. And so on patients, he was doing one procedure for half their face and another procedure for the other half of their face, and then seeing how it turned out. And I mean, as much as that's horrifying to me, and it should be to everybody else, the problem was that he didn't have a clear enough consent form. The patients didn't know what they were agreeing to do. And this has been going on because there's so much research being done outside the academic research atmosphere. So my attempt was to get a standardized IRB protocol and common rule. The issue of these central IRBs, it is certainly not our intention to push anybody into these for-profit institutions. We think sometimes these can work, but we don't think that it's our role in government to make people go into these. But if we have standardized protocols, I think it will really help. And in addition, as I said in my remarks, let's say you want to do a partnership with the University of Colorado and do some research in collaboration. If you have a core common rule, if you have some centralized, or if you have some standardized procedures, then that should be able to help with efficiency around doing that patient research. So that's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
Hi. Michele Argan. I'm a faculty in pharmaceutical chemistry and associate director of the Small Molecule Discovery Center. So we work in drug discovery. And It seems that, especially talking about Medicare versus the FDA, and also if you bring in patent law, that one of the big problems with developing new drugs is that all these different agencies have different constituencies and different goals, and they're not a straight line. So the patent law encourages you to get quickly through the FDA because you have a limited patent life,
Right.
and that increases drug costs, which is a major problem, of course, for federal government. But at the same time, the FDA wants it to be safe, and so that extends the time. And then Medicare wants it to be cheap, so that works against. So it seems like only the federal government can take all these different major institutions and bring them into alignment.
Well, that's exactly what Fred and I are trying to do, is look at all of those issues, and there are some inherent tensions. The good news, I will say, is having worked really closely with the leaders of these various agencies, these federal agencies, they are all really cognizant of these challenges and tensions too. So in the past, the way that federal government was set up around biomedical research, it was like everybody was antagonistic to everybody else. You know, FDA didn't talk to CMS, didn't talk to NIH, didn't, and so on. And the common enemy was private industry, right? You know, they're knocking at our doors, and we've got to stop them from whatever terrible things they want to do. Now there's a recognition among all of these agencies that we need to have collaboration with both medical researchers and institutions and private industry, but most importantly within those agencies. And I think one of the very hopeful signs of this is that rather than pushing back against us and our attempts to modernize biomedical research in this country, actually Dr. Collins, Dr. Hamburg, and Ms. Burwell, the head of HHS, Sylvia Burwell, they're all working with us as our jury to review this to make sure that it's working. So that's all good news.
Yeah, I would just encourage you to also include patent law as part of that.
Yeah, oh, we do, don't worry. I mean, data exclusivity is one of the big issues that we're trying to deal with.
And patent life.
Right, exactly. Let me just say one thing about the patents, then I'll go to you, is again, it's a balance between encouraging innovation and encouraging competition too. And we're particularly seeing that with some of the biologics and some of the other drugs and therapeutics that are hard to develop. You want to give a long period to the exclusivity, but then on the other hand, you want to have the competition to bring the cost down and more availability for patients. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dan Doan from the Institute for Health Policy Studies, and I'm leading with some colleagues an effort across the UC campuses, the medical centers, looking at biobanking, the donation of specimens to biobanks. And we've actually talked to ordinary folks in Northern California and Southern California about this, and they raised a couple of issues that I wanted to bounce off you and hear what you're hearing in your roundtables about these issues. One is they're really enthusiastic and supportive of research.
Yes.
At the same time, we spent a tremendous amount of energy educating them about what actually goes into this type of biobanking and genomic research. So one issue they raised was, how come other people don't know about this, and how do we educate the public about those issues, and so they can understand and appreciate how this happens in the scientific community. And then the second issue on the other side was sort of concerns about privacy, and we're in the Facebook world, and hearing about those types of issues around how do you maintain your privacy. And I'm wondering if those are themes that you've heard, and how we can get the public to better understand the balance between those two issues.
I don't think those are two separate themes. I think they're part of the same theme. But we have been talking about that issue, and what's interesting is that some folks have actually, you might have too, some folks have done surveys and studies around this, and what they've learned is once you explain to the public about what this data banking could be, what the information would be, what it could be used for, and also explaining how you can ensure privacy, the vast majority of Americans say, yes, I would want to to donate my health information to such a data bank. And so I think that part of the whole situation is, until recently, we haven't had the technology to be able to collect this data, to be able to store it, and then to be able to use it in a way that would be beneficial, but now we're there. And so what we need to use our federal institutions to do is to try to promote that and also to ensure privacy. And I think you're going to be seeing more and more public education around this once we get the mechanisms set up. But I know I was just hearing at lunch about the wonderful collaboration you all have in the Bay Area here, and how much data that you're able to bank and have, and there's some efforts like that around the country, but there's nothing that's been a national effort, and we still need to get the interoperability and the technology worked out before we can have all of that. And that's where, again, a place where I think the federal government can help, because the NIH and the researchers there can really take the lead on pulling together national, pull together, for example, a consortium of all of these regional groups that are doing this. So we're really excited about it, and so are these institutions.
Yeah. Tom Hull from the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. I wonder if you could comment on the political realities of revising the regulations, whether your colleague in the House can actually bring a majority of Republicans to address regulations, and whether there's any other encouraging news about possible reforms or acceptance of better research. The Affordable Care Act, I know the Republicans have been quite hostile to monitoring those things.
Well, the cheerful thing about this effort is that it has been completely bipartisan. I was telling some war stories over lunch. We had a series of formal hearings in our committee. Fred, as I mentioned, is the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I'm one of the most senior Democrats on that committee. And we had a whole series of hearings that were refreshingly nonpartisan. I don't know if any of you saw our Ebola hearing yesterday we had in my subcommittee, but we were even able to make Ebola a partisan issue, which was pretty stunning to me, right? But the 21st Century Cures hearings were completely bipartisan. And then we had a series of roundtables where we brought experts in from around the country to sit at these roundtables, and we had Democrats and Republicans there. And at one point, Fred even handed me the gavel, which was, the earth shook as if we were in San Francisco at that moment when he handed me the gavel. So it has been completely bipartisan, and that's the good news. Having been in Congress now a long time, I will tell you that there has been an increasing hunger among people on both sides of the aisle to try to find something to work together. It's not a universal feeling in Congress. We still have partisanship. We still have some partisanship, and it's 2.5 weeks before the election, so here we are. But I have sensed an increasing hunger to work on something big that would benefit the country, and so I actually think that we have a real chance to pass this. As I say often to people, disease doesn't just strike Democrats or Republicans, it affects every single one of our families. And so part of what I'm doing, and part of what I challenge the folks at the roundtable at lunch to do, and I will challenge you to do this too, as we move forward with this effort with 21st Century Cures, members of Congress from both parties need to be hearing from their constituents. As you heard, I was the chief architect, along with Congressman Mike Castle, a Republican, for the embryonic stem cell research bill. And we passed that bill through a Republican House and through a Republican Senate, only to have it vetoed not once but twice by President Bush. But then I was able to persuade President Obama to do the executive order to expand the research. And the way we did that is we went around the country and we talked to different groups about how important embryonic stem cell research was and why we had to have these ethical guidelines released by the NIH. And so members of Congress, they were approached by disease advocates, by researchers, by everybody, by Nancy Reagan. You know, everybody helped in this effort, and we were able to pass this. And this is what we're going to need to do with 21st Century Cures. I've been talking to all of the disease advocacy groups about how important this is, and the device companies and the pharmaceutical companies about how you need to talk to everybody about this. I think the biggest stumbling block that we're going to have is you can't get something for nothing. So if you don't want this to be just a revision of some of the rules, or the travel rules or the conference rules or something like that, if you want this to be big, it's going to cost money. And so what I've told people is, if you have a program that you think could really make a difference, like having a centralized data registry or something like that, you need to be able, gone are the days when we're going to just simply say we're going to double the NIH budget. Instead, what we have to be able to do is say, this is going to be a key component to 21st Century Cures, and here's how much it's going to cost, and we need to find the bipartisan will to do it. I think that's going to be the most difficult part, and I've talked at length to Fred about this, but I think people are hungering for this, and after we introduce the bill, I think you're going to see a lot of grassroots support. So I'm excited about it, and I wouldn't be spending a lot of effort working on it if I didn't think we could do something big. Ken.
Do you think that, it's been a pleasure working with you in Washington and seeing your leadership there, and in particular, I think you have a really sophisticated understanding of the ways that kind of the siloing of our efforts have been damaging and holding us back at a time when there's great opportunity. So I want to ask you a question about that from the legislative side, because it's been my experience that the federal budgeting process it creates very hard silo walls that the agencies, some of whom we've seen sat in your roundtables and watch talking in very cooperative ways, are still not really building programs that are really interactive and cooperative. I've been involved a little bit in the Obama Brain Initiative and was in a meeting of those that are creating the big data computational platforms. As you know, that initiative is funded by 4 different federal agencies. And hearing their reports, even though this is one initiative, it really was as if they hadn't spoken at all with each other about what they were crafting for their big data, big cooperative efforts. It's sort of understandable given the fact that each of the agencies has to go to the Hill every year and defend what they're doing. And one of the ways they do that is to create a uniqueness in what they do compared to what another agency does. So my question is whether you think there may be any legislative routes to being able to promote, let's put it that way, agencies really working together, creating a special pot of budget that would be available if the two or more agencies can come together and say that the Department of Energy, with its fantastic supercomputer capacities, and the NIH with its tremendous health resources, have sat down together to work out a single program that would really begin to build the kind of big data initiative that's going to be necessary to move precision medicine that we've talked about before, forward. What do you think about the possibilities for moving in that direction?
Dr. Yamamoto is one of our key in-house experts. He's now been to 2 of our roundtables, so we bounce everything off of him now. But I think you make a really good point about budgeting, and part of it is that budgeting in an era of restrictions makes people even more wanting to keep their budgets close. Oops, there's a There's a couple of things we can do. One of the things that we can do is we can break down some of the institutional barriers that we've had. I've talked to many groups about how when the NIH was set up, we had all of these different silos of the different institutes at the NIH, and we've now realized that the way biomedical research has developed, there's so much interaction between the different disease groups that it really doesn't make so much sense to have that siloed. When we reauthorized the NIH about 7 or 8 years ago, what we did was we took some of those resources out of the institutes and we put that into the director's office so that the director could really do much more cross-disciplinary research, and that has helped somewhat. I think we can do even more of that with financial resources, which is to put together some, but somebody has to administer it too, but rather than rewarding the different agencies for duplicative effort and giving them more money to have their siloed efforts, to really reward them for pooling that and for having a collaborative effort. I think this effort will be eased if you actually have adequate funding and stable funding for these agencies. The two things really go hand in hand, but that's one thing that we're really talking about trying to make happen.
These types of breakthroughs are also the leading accelerator of healthcare costs, and I was wondering if there's whether you feel there's also going to be the ability to have a bipartisan effort to either control these costs or pay for them, and that there's the saying in health policy that we have the greatest health care in the world. It's really unfortunate that no one can afford it. So are we actually going to be able to spend this, and what does a 21st century state spend on healthcare costs? Are we comfortable with spending 40–50% of GDP on healthcare costs a year?
So in my role on the Energy and Commerce Committee, I also was one of the key architects of the House version of the Affordable Care Act. And one thing that we've been very concerned about is the spiraling of healthcare costs in this country. And that was one of the issues that we tried to tackle in the Affordable Care Act, is trying to get some best practice guidelines to try to figure out efficiencies, like through electronic medical records and standardization of practice in hospitals and so on and so forth. I will say, if you'll cast your memory back to when we passed that bill, remember we ended up having to pass the Senate version of the bill, which in that particular respect was much weaker than the House version. And we went forward with it anyway because we felt like we had to get some kind of process begun to get some healthcare reform in this country. Now, the bad news is that you might have seen that we've now had, 53 or 43 votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I lose track over time, We've had vote after vote to repeal the ACA, and we've had very little effort, we've actually had no effort to fix the ACA. And that would naturally come through my committee, the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, to do the hearings on what we've done to start to standardize those medical practices and to bring the cost down. I, on a regular basis, nag my chairman to have those hearings, and I'm hoping after the next election that we've had now almost 10 million people sign up under the ACA. We've insured a lot of people under the Medicaid expansion in many states. We're not going to be repealing the Affordable Care Act. So now it's time for us to come together in a bipartisan way and to start figuring out how to improve it and make it better. And this is one of the areas that I think we really need to beef up as we do that. Even so, if you look at most of the studies since the ACA started, it started before last October, but the enrollment of the people on the exchange started on October 1st. the cost curve has now started to bend for healthcare costs in this country. In other words, getting people into insurance has actually helped us bend those cost curves, because you don't have as many people at your hospital showing up without insurance to get treatment. So that's been a positive step, but I think we can make a lot more improvements, not just in cost, in reducing costs, but improving care if we aggressively implement these other areas. So, that's under the ACA. Let me just talk for a minute about cost and the way we do biomedical research. I've talked a lot about this because it's mystifying to me. The way the Congressional Budget Office decides how much something is going to cost is by deciding how much they can project that it's actually going to cost. So, for example, if we're trying to put some preventative medicine into place, they actually score that as a higher cost than not doing preventative medicine, because the patient will live longer, and so therefore it'll cost more over their lives, which I think is insane. I think the better approach, of course, is to give a higher score for anything that would prevent disease and that would encourage wellness. And I've been complaining about this for some years now. I tried to put together legislation some years ago, which I was never able to pass. But now there are two Congresspeople, Mike Burgess, a Republican from Texas who's a doctor, and Donna Christensen, the delegate from the Virgin Islands, also a medical doctor, who have a bill to try to do exactly this, to fix the way we think about costs in this country and to give extra for therapies that will improve health and prevent disease. And we're hoping that we can incorporate some of those provisions into the 21st Century Cures Bill. Not only will that help us fund our bill, but it also has the added benefit of being true. So that's all good.
Well, I think you would all agree that we have a tremendous amount to thank the Congresswoman for, including this lecture today, but the fight that she takes to Congress every day on issues that are of critical importance to us. But I would say what's really energized me is it's one of the, if not the only talk I've heard in recent time, and by recent I mean in the last several years, from one of our representatives in Washington, who sets a really optimistic, can-do, positive tone. And I wish we heard more of that, but it's been really refreshing.
Well, I'll convert everybody, and then I'll have them come and talk to you. I must say it's a delight to be here, and a little daunting to come and talk to a whole room of medical professionals who know far more about this than I'll ever learn. So thank you, Chancellor.
Please join me.